Last month, I described the events of Bloody Sunday as well as the IRA ambush at Kilmichael as a decisive turning point in the war. Of course, it took some time for the powers that be in London to get that message, but the repercussions were beginning to ripple out. The IRA, probably feeling like they had the wind in their sails, continued their campaign throughout the country. Every month they put up a map highlighting the counties where IRA attacks took place. There was great variance in the intensity of these attacks. What's notable is that in terms of the frequency and the intensity of the engagements, is that the most dramatic ones took place in the province of Munster and most famously, of course, in County Cork. Martial law was declared in the Munster counties of Cork, Limerick, Kerry and Tipperary. This month, the Black and Tans would burn down the city centre of Cork in retaliation for one such attack. The British policy of reprisals, up to now unofficial, would at last be recognised and become an official strategy of Crown forces. Speaking of the map, there were IRA attacks in the following counties: Dublin, Armagh, Clare, Tipperary, Cork, Kilkenny and Limerick. In September, the RAC office issued a circular stating that reprisals will be detrimental to the morale of the police and could not be an official policy. Of course, there was a great amount of equivocation in this circular, on the one hand condemning reprisals as bad for both the local economy and for the country as a whole, and on the other putting the blame squarely on the shoulders of the IRA, stating that stopping reprisals was straightforward: stop shooting the police. As always, the British authorities had a blinkered view of the situation in Ireland. A part of the problem was the overly optimistic reports coming from the RAC. They argued in November that public opinion was beginning to move away from Sinn Féin and the IRA, claiming great success in rooting out the organisation in Galway and Limerick. They further claimed that the, quote, more responsible persons, unquote, had returned to sanity and now held the Republicans in revulsion. Who these more responsible persons were is anyone's guess. There were elements in London, particularly from the Liberal establishment, who felt that the policy of reprisals was detrimental and indeed would only feed radicalism. One such exponent of this was Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India. The rump of the IPP party in Westminster also beat the drum for a much more moderate approach to the Irish question, as it was known. There was no reprisal after Kilmichael, which perhaps in itself is rather strange, but one of the most immediate consequences of the ambush was the imposition of martial law in Cork, Limerick, Kerry and Tipperary, as I said earlier. Much to the dismay of the military leadership, Dublin, an obvious hotspot of IRA activity, would not fall under martial law at the behest of Prime Minister Lloyd George. 4 more counties would be added to this special military area in early 1921: Clare, Waterford, Kilkenny and Wexford. Although most of these counties were relatively quiet, the main reason they were added was because General Strickland wanted the martial law area to correspond with the area of the 6th Division. Soon after the imposition of martial law, the biggest reprisal of the war so far took place with the burning of Cork City. On 11th of December, a patrol was ambushed in Cork just in front of the heavily guarded Victoria Barracks. That evening, a group of soldiers set fire to a big part of the main shopping street in the city, as well as Carnegie Library and City Hall. An absurd allegation in the Daily Telegraph suggested that the IRA itself set fire to the city in order to derail potential peace talks and discredit moderate elements in Sinn Féin. The government refused to set up an official inquiry, so the ILPTUC set up its own, entitled Who Burnt Cork City? The British Labour Party also collaborated with investigations of its own. The report presented on December 29th was subversive to the official line. The report noted that, quote, in every part of Ireland that we visited, we were impressed by the atmosphere of terrorism which prevailed, unquote. This was not, however, directed at the IRA, but rather at Crown forces. They described British reprisals as cruel and inhuman and, quote, a confession of bankruptcy, of statesmanship and desperate expedient of men lost to all sense of humanity, unquote. It argued that the IRA could not be defeated militarily, precisely because it was not a regular army, and because it was absorbed into the general population when not on active duty. The report argued that only negotiation could bring an end to the conflict. Maybe it's just me, but I get the feeling that this report, albeit from a relatively fringe left-wing perspective, was the start of the ticking clock that would eventually culminate in the treaty negotiations next year. I also want to talk a little bit here about the Roman Catholic Church. Many lower level clergy were sympathetic Republicans. Indeed, Father Michael McFlanagan was joint vice president of Sinn Féin, an interesting man with unusually socialist politics for a Catholic priest of his vintage. Daniel Cohalan, the Bishop of Cork, speaking after Terence McSwiney's death in October, lionised him as one of Ireland's greatest martyrs. Cohalan was also an admirer of the Dáil courts and praised Sinn Féin's revolutionary administration. But after the burning of Cork City, he seemed to have had a change of heart. He sermonised that shooting policemen was murder and that burning barracks was destruction of Irish property. He referred to the cycle of reprisals and counter-reprisals as, quote, a devil's competition, unquote. He also stated that IRA ambushes which directly led to government reprisals were unjustifiable and wrong, and then went on to excommunicate all murderers. The reaction from Sinn Féin was swift, perhaps fearing a collapse in morale in what was an extremely Catholic country. The Lord Mayor of Cork, J.J. Walsh, appealed to the bishop to reconsider, suggesting that the IRA were the legitimate army of a legitimate republic who were fighting a just war. Cohalan denied the legitimacy of the republic. He later wrote in February, responding to criticism, that the declaration of the Dáil in January 1919 was not by a legitimate country, therefore there was no competent authority that could wage a so-called just war that would be in accordance with Catholic teachings. It's difficult to say what the impact was. A few IRA men seem to have become rabidly anti-clerical as a result of this, although perhaps the later behaviour of the church in the Civil War influenced them even more. Clearly, many IRA men were troubled by the declaration and subsequent pastoral letter. In the end, Cohalan did not necessarily represent the views of the hierarchy, which was staunchly, almost manically conservative. Even Cardinal Logue, moved by the events of Bloody Sunday, put more opprobrium on the Crown forces. In the end, the great fear among the Sinn Féin leadership was a papal condemnation of the campaign. In the end, this never came, and despite Bishop Cohalan undoubtedly giving many IRA men restless nights, in the end his excommunication didn't have the effect you might have expected. Just to wrap up here, the Government of Ireland Act officially went into practice this month, creating the entities of Northern and Southern Ireland. Thanks for watching, see you again soon now, cheers now, good luck.